But I felt like I wanted to say that because what it means for us when we come and we gather for worship is it is taking all of the junk and the conflict and the tension and the stuff that's out there and saying, how do I live faithfully as a Christian? And then church is coming together on Sunday mornings, worshiping God, getting reoriented, getting realigned. Okay, this is who I am. This is who God made me to be. This is what God's calling us to do. And so I hope that you feel the tension of being in the world but not of the world. That's my disclaimer for the introduction, okay? Okay, so the political thing will last a second, so those of you who are already worried, it's going to last a second, then we're going to move on. So perhaps you've heard of the website Snopes. Anybody familiar with Snopes? It is an independent fact-checking website. It started back in the 90s when the internet was like really kind of coming out. And it's this fact-checking thing. Now, they're not sponsored by a political party. They don't receive funding from different people. They just do advertising. And they use humans, not AI or automation, to get their facts and verify things. And what they do is they take controversial things that are kind of out there on the internet, and then they fact-check it. Who said this? Where did it come from? Is this picture real? Where did it first originate? Who put it out on the internet first? So it's this fact-checking website, Snopes. It is, and so this week, one of the news items that was out and about was related to the Epstein files, and there were a couple things that came up with this Epstein files conversation. I'm not going to show these pictures because, well, a couple reasons. Not to mention they're inappropriate for church. But one of the pictures that came out was our current First Lady, Melania Trump, in the same picture as Jeffrey Epstein. It's not a flattering picture of her. It's her doing things that she shouldn't be doing and putting herself out there. And it's a picture of her doing these things with Jeffrey Epstein there. And the message of the picture was to say she knew him and she's been part of whatever evil he's been part of. Well, the picture was fake. Snopes did the research on it, and they said this is where it came from. We can tell that it originated here from this person who. But it's with AI technology. It looks real. It looked real, but it wasn't. It was some made-up story. And so if you're scrolling through social media, you scroll through, you see this picture, and you think, oh, that doesn't look good, but it's a lie. Well, on the other side of the aisle, same thing happened this past week with Hillary Clinton. She had made a public statement that said something to the effect of, I don't recall ever meeting Jeffrey Epstein. And then a few days later, this picture comes out, and it's a picture of her and her husband and Jeffrey Epstein all standing together laughing like they're having a good old time. Once again, fake. It didn't come from anywhere. Somebody took AI, took the technology, and made the picture look a certain way, and so it made it look like Hillary Clinton's a liar, and so then here's the picture that proves it. My point in saying these things is that we are in this moment in time, in this moment with AI, in this moment with social media, where we're constantly asking the question, what is true? Is this real? We can't trust what we see because we simply don't know. And so we're bombarded constantly by this fact or that fact, things that are presented to us as truths. And frankly, it's emotionally exhausting sorting through all these competing truth claims. Is this person telling the truth, or is that person telling the truth? Is this side telling the truth, or is that side telling the truth? Or is it some sort of mixed bag? The anxiety that we have about, well, what if I'm wrong? Or the frustration we feel of, I'm totally right and this other person is wrong. How can they think the way they do? Well, they're maybe getting a whole different stream of media feed that's full of lies, and maybe it's different from the lies that you're receiving too. There's a lot of pressure to sort through this stuff. There's a lot of cultural pressure to figure out what side are we on, what's really true. Today, we're starting a new 5-week series that centers on the person of Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate, the governor in the area where Jesus was put to death, the governor who ultimately sentenced Jesus to crucifixion. Pontius Pilate was put in a position of having to define reality, of having to investigate truth, to examine evidence, and to reach a verdict on whether Jesus was guilty or not. Now, over the next 5 weeks, we're 5 weeks away from Easter, and over these next 5 weeks, we're going to be preparing ourselves for Easter, leaning into the story, leaning into the events of Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate is all over the New Testament, interestingly. In fact, did you notice that Pontius Pilate was in the Apostles' Creed today? We're going on this Apostles' Creed, all these statements about God, Creator, and Jesus, the Son, virgin birth, and then there's this random line about, it feels random, about was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Like, what's Pontius Pilate doing in the Apostles' Creed? Well, the idea there is that the people putting the creed together said, we want people to know that Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection was a historical fact, grounded in history, grounded in truth, and so this is the timestamp. It happened under the reign of Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was real. Jesus is real. This happened under him. Pontius Pilate is an important figure in the story of Jesus, and we're going to study him and get to know him a little better over these next few weeks. Pilate is this governor over the area of Judea. It's a large region. He was described by people who knew him as merciless and obstinate, as a man who was exceedingly angry, and one person said, a man of most ferocious passions. He was known for his cruelty, and Pilate would eventually stand trial himself for cruelty and oppression, particularly on the charge that he was executing men without proper trials. But let's back up before we get to the passage about Pontius Pilate today. We're going to be looking at John 18, which is an encounter with Pilate. All four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all address Pontius Pilate and have his story. We're going to be looking at John today. But before Jesus comes before Pontius Pilate, there are some things that lead up to this moment. First, you need to understand just a little bit of what's going on historically. So Pilate is he's the governor over the region of Judea. But the Jews had their own religion slash government that they had. And so the Jews were, through their Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin, they could exercise many of their own laws. And the chief priests, the Jewish leaders, they do not like Jesus. Jesus is a threat to them. Jesus is messing up their theology. Jesus is saying things like he is the Messiah, the Son of God. And they're like, no, you're not. You can't say stuff like that. That's a lie. That's not true. And so the Jewish leaders hated Jesus. They hated his popularity. They hated what he stood for. They hated that people followed him. They hated that he did miracles. They hated that he seemed to be perfect. That had to be so annoying to them. But they hated him. And so they held their own 3-part trial. They recruited a man by the name of Judas Iscariot, and they said, Judas, we're going to pay you a bunch of money if you can tell us where Jesus is and turn him over to us. Do it in the middle of the night, under cover of darkness. We'll pay you a bunch of money. So they recruit Judas. Judas does it. Judas betrays Jesus. The Sanhedrin there, the temple soldiers go and arrest Jesus at night as Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then they take Jesus bound like a criminal to the Jewish courts. And the Jews hold they hold 3 different religious courts to determine, did he break Jewish law? And there are these sham trials. They're making up all sorts of things. They're bringing false charges against Jesus, and nobody can agree on a testimony, but people are just talking and spreading lies, and there's this false campaign, this smear campaign of all these things that he hasn't done that they're saying that he's done. But anyway, they eventually decide, well, he is guilty, and he needs to die. They reach this verdict kind of in a roundabout way. And so they say, he needs to die according to our law, but the Jews didn't have the right to crucify or to kill anybody. Only the Roman government could do that because Rome was over, the Roman Empire was over and was the governing authority over that area. And so they say, all right, we got to take Jesus to Pilate because Pilate's the only one who can kill him, and crucifixion was the common form of public execution. So that's how we get to this point. These 3 sham trials have already happened. They've happened throughout the night. They've all been awake all night long. And very, very early in the morning, on Friday morning, they show up before Pilate, and they say, Pilate, we've got somebody who is a criminal, and you've got to kill him. That brings us to John chapter 18. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" Now, I'd like you to pay attention to the questions Pilate is asking. He asks a lot of questions. "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate says, "What'd he do?" And the Jews essentially say, "Never mind the specifics. He's a criminal. Just believe us." Pilate said, verse 31, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." He's like, "You've got your Jewish law. Go do your Jewish law thing. We're for the really bad stuff. You do your thing." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. We know here from some of the other Gospels that come in and tell a little piece of the story about what they tell Pilate. Just take a quick jump over to Luke 23, verse 2. It says, "And they, the chief priests, began to accuse Jesus, saying, 'We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king.'" Now that sounds pretty bad. I mean, subverting the nation? He's leading an insurrection? He opposes payment of taxes, like he's against the government. He's against Caesar. And he claims to be a king. That's a threat to Caesar. That's a threat to Roman government. Like, clearly Pilate, he is a big, big problem. So Pilate asked Jesus, verse 3, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, Snopes check here. Jesus didn't actually oppose paying taxes. He actually encouraged people to pay taxes. He's not doing any of the things that they're claiming that he does. Back to John 18, the story continues in verse 33. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" See, Pilate's still asking. Pilate's doing the examination. He's probing. He's asking questions. "Who are you?" "You're a king," they say. Pilate responds, "Am I a Jew? Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you've done? What's going on here?" Verse 36, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Pilate's trying to figure this out. He's asking questions, he's probing, he's digging in. It seems like he's trying to get to the bottom of what the truth is here. So when Pilate says, "You are a king," I don't think Pilate is really worried that Jesus is going to take over Caesar. I don't think he feels particularly threatened by Jesus at this point. I think that Pilate is saying this with a little bit of irony. Jesus certainly doesn't look like much of a king at this point. He's been up all night. He's in handcuffs. His hands are tied behind his back. And he doesn't look very strong or powerful. And then Jesus is having these deep conversations about, "I'm from a kingdom from another place." And he says things like, "I would have servants fighting for me, but my kingdom isn't part of this world." I mean, he sounds a little crazy. I don't think Pilate's too worried at this point. And I don't think Pilate understands everything that's going on here, but he does realize at this moment that this is not about a political kingdom and that Jesus isn't a threat to Caesar. Jesus answered him, "You say that I am a king. In fact," listen to this, "the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." The next verse, Pilate says, "What is truth?" Jesus says, "I came here for truth. I came here to speak truth. The whole reason I came into this world is to testify to the truth, to reveal truth and to testify to what it is." Jesus says, "I'm on a truth mission." He says this world is cloaked in lies. This world is cloaked in untruth. This world needs some fact-checking about who's really in charge and what the plan really is for human existence. I am on a truth mission. My mission, Jesus says, essentially is to be a spiritual Snopes, to reveal the truth to a blind and hopeless humanity. I love the verse in John 1:17 that says, "For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." He came to bring grace and truth to people lost in darkness. Jesus is appealing to Pilate. He's going to Pilate and he's saying, Pilate, let's talk about truth. Pilate, you're exploring the truth. Pilate, you're trying to get to the bottom of what the truth is in this situation. Let's talk about truth. Come on, Pilate. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. Pilate, will you listen to me? And Pilate understands that Jesus is ready to engage him on truth. But Pilate decides he doesn't want to engage on truth. He's uncomfortable. He wants to end the conversation. And so he turns to Jesus and he says, what is truth? What is truth? Yeah, that's not what we're going to talk about right now. What's going on with this question? The verse says, what is truth? Retorted Pilate. If he's retorting, it makes me think that he's not saying, philosophically, what is truth? Let's have a deep conversation. He's saying, what is truth? I'm done with the conversation. Nobody can really know what truth is. Pilate would have been influenced by Hellenistic or Greek philosophy, which says you can't ultimately know truth. Truth doesn't really exist. Pilate is uninterested in having these deep, spiritual, philosophical conversations. He's like, I've got a job to do right now. Not really interested in having a philosophy lesson right now. Pilate doesn't want to dig deeper. He's more concerned with keeping the peace. There's going to be a riot if he doesn't deal with this whole situation. He's got a job to do. He's like, not having the conversation. The passage then continues, and this is where we'll end today in the passage. In verse 38, with this, Pilate went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, I find no basis for a charge against him. Now, Pilate actually does this several times. We're about halfway through all of the trials of Jesus before he gets bound, tortured, and then led out to be crucified. But at this point, Pilate, and at several other points, Pilate is going to come back to the Jews multiple times and say, I don't see why he would be guilty for anything. I see no basis for a charge against him. I've examined him, and he's a little crazy, but he doesn't need to die. He says this multiple times. But if you know the story, Jesus ends up being crucified. There's a breakdown between what Pilate actually thinks is true and then what he's willing to stand for. Pilate is unwilling to be changed by truth. He digs in, he asks good questions, he examines the charges, he recognizes innocence, he has a level of discernment, and he says, I find no basis for a charge, but he doesn't stand his ground. He doesn't defend the innocent man enough. And he walks away when truth becomes costly to him. The man who could have stopped it doesn't. Jesus says, the reason I was born, I came to this world, was to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. And he's inviting Pilate to dialogue. He's saying, truth is with me. Truth is with me, a person. Truth is a person to be obeyed. But Pilate pushes truth away so he can keep the peace, protect his career, avoid conflict, preserve his image. And I think this relates to us, because I think that culture tells us things like, truth is personal. Truth is subjective. What's true for you is not always true for me. You have your truth, and I have my truth. Who's to say that you've got the right truth? That's the battle over our social media right now. That's the battle in the political field. Who's to say that you've got the right truth? Culture tells us things like, live your truth. It's presented to us as if truth is what we want it to be. Truth is what we think it is. It implies that we define what is true ourselves, and there's no cosmic Snopes for fact-checking. But if you are king of your truth, and if you define what is true for you, then you are placing yourself as the sovereign king. You are setting yourself up as the judge, as the governor, as the Pontius Pilate. You don't have to surrender to God's standard. You don't have to repent of pushing your false truth over God's. You don't have to confront that you might be believing lies as truth. Pilate asks, what is truth? But he does it in a way that protects his authority. He wants to hang on to that gavel for himself. I think, church, that we don't struggle because we can't find truth. We struggle because truth demands allegiance. We don't struggle because we can't find truth. Truth is closer than we think. But truth requires that we obey. And we have to decide if we're going to do it or not. And I think that when it comes to seeking truth in this world, like Pilate, we ask questions, we dig in, we might even admire the teachings of Jesus, but when Jesus claims authority over our preferences, over the way that we think things should be run, when Jesus claims authority over our bodies or our sexuality or our money, when Jesus claims authority over our career advancement and what we do with our lives, we hesitate because we want our truth to win. I think Pilate's asking the wrong question here. He's asking the question, what is truth? But I think the real question is, what will you do with truth? I'd like to share briefly 2 truths about truth. 2 truths about truth. Number 1, truth is not a concept, but a person. The Bible presents truth as embodied in the person of Jesus. Here's what truth is not. Truth is not found in sincerity. You can be sincerely convinced that something is true, but even if you really, really believe it, your sincerity doesn't make it true. The strength of how much you want it to be doesn't mean that it's true. Truth is also not desire. Just because you want it to be true doesn't mean that it is. We call that wishful thinking. Truth is not the majority opinion. Just because most of the people in America think that something is true doesn't make it true. God doesn't define his truth according to what the majority vote on. Truth is not my truth, your truth, his truth, her truth. Truth is truth, and truth is God's. What is truth? Truth is Jesus himself. John 1:14 says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." Wow, do you know anybody who's full of grace and truth? I like being around people who are full of grace and truth. Jesus is full of grace and truth himself. John 14:6, Jesus says, "I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Jesus is telling us that truth is ultimately not found in concepts. Truth is found in the person of Jesus. This is a different way of thinking about it. It's not just ideas or opinions. It's rooted in who Jesus is. C.S. Lewis has a book called Mere Christianity. It's a little paperback book that helps you when you're wrestling with the questions of if Christianity is true or not. It's a great little book. You should read it if you haven't. And in this book, C.S. Lewis challenges us to figure out, what are we going to do with the fact that Jesus makes outrageous claims about himself? Jesus says things like, "I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life." Now, if you knew of a person who created a social media meme that says, "I am the truth," you would be like, uh-huh. You wouldn't even need Snopes. You would know, no, they're not. They do not embody truth. That person doesn't personify truth. But Jesus says, "I am the truth." That is an outrageous claim. Now, we're used to it because we're churchified, and so we've heard this, and so we're used to this idea that Jesus is the truth. But when Jesus is saying, "I am the truth," that's quite the claim. He's saying you can't get to God unless you go through me. Jesus says, no other religion, no other God will satisfy the requirements for you to get right with him. That's a claim that doesn't always rub us the right way. Jesus says there is one truth, there is a way, and I am it. We sang a song a few weeks ago, let all the other names fade away. He says, I'm it. Now, there are some people out there who don't have saving faith in Jesus. They haven't put their trust in him, but they like Jesus. Jesus is a good guy. He teaches, he's a good moral man. He teaches us to love each other. He teaches people to be kind to one another. He teaches people to sacrifice for one another. I like those values. So Jesus is a good moral teacher. But C.S. Lewis says, you can't think of Jesus as a good moral teacher if you don't also believe he's God. He says, Jesus must be either liar, lunatic, or Lord. Jesus either is deliberately lying to you, where some things he says you like and you think are true, but other things he says like he's the only way to heaven. If Jesus knew that he was not God but claimed to be, then he's intentionally deceiving people. That's not being a great moral teacher. Jesus also might be considered a lunatic by some. I mean, he's saying he's the Son of God. He's saying things like, I have a kingdom that's from another world. And if I were in the other world, then they would come and rescue me. But, they're in another world right now, so they're not going to come and rescue me right now. It sounds a little crazy. So you have to either believe Jesus is either delusional or it's actually true. Which one is it? You can't have it both ways. Is he a liar? Is he a lunatic, or he's just kind of nuts? Or is he actually who he says he is? Is he actually Lord? Is he actually God in the flesh? Is he actually the definer of truth? Is he actually the way of life? Is he actually the defeater of lies and deception and misinformation and propaganda from the enemy? Is he truly the light that shines on our darkness? Is he the Lord? A lot of us live like we believe Jesus is a good moral teacher. Okay, he's not a liar. He's not a lunatic. I believe he's Lord, but we don't take it seriously because if Jesus is Lord, that means he's in charge. Truth is located in him. 2 truths about truth. The first one is that truth is found in a person. The second one is this. Truth is costly, but it sets you free. It's costly, but it sets you free. Pilate didn't want truth because it was going to cost him. It was going to cost him credibility with the Jewish leaders. They're the most influential Jews that he had to deal with. He had to deal with them all the time. He's like, I don't want to deal with, they're crazy. It was going to cost him politically. If he doesn't kill Jesus, then people are going to be mad at him, and maybe he's not going to be able to keep his post. He's going to lose his post and won't be governor anymore. Truth is costly. It was costly in that Pilate didn't want to deal with those deeper questions. He wanted to just deal with what was practical, what was right in front of him. He didn't want to deal with the bigger things. And so here Pilate has truth in his face. And he says, I don't want to pay that price. We want to be free. We are all on a journey toward freedom. Pilate wanted to understand truth, but he did not want to submit to truth. And similarly, I think that we find it hard to pay the price of giving up our own ideas of what's true and submitting to what God says is true. This goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, when there's Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and the serpent comes along to tempt them, and he says, is it true that God told you did not eat from that tree? Is it true that you will really die if you do? And he plants these seeds of questioning truth. He gets a foothold in their lives, and they succumb to that. And ever since humanity caved to that temptation to question truth, humanity has been bound up in a web of deceit and lies that the enemy spins. And we're born into this world, we call it a fallen world that we're born into, that's under the impression of sin. And we are born into a veiled world in which truth is not always as clear as what we would hope it would be. The Bible tells us that Satan is the father of all lies. The Bible tells us that his power is derived from deception. Satan thrives on deception. Satan thrives on half-truths. Satan thrives on taking a little bit of truth and twisting it. His power comes from deception, and therefore his influence is broken when his lies are exposed and replaced with God's truth. This is the power of Jesus, who said, I came to this world so that I could reveal truth. I came to this world so that the truth would be made known. Jesus says, I want you to see clearly the deception of the enemy and the truth of who I am and what can be. Christians defeat lies with truth. That's a lot of what the Christian life is. Identifying, oh, that's a lie. That's a lie I've been believing. That's a lie I've been living by. The Christian life is learning how to recognize, reject, and then replace the enemy's lies with Scripture's truth. We call this gaining the mind of Christ. To live in the truth of who we are in Christ. Truth is costly, but it sets you free. Jesus said in John 8:31, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Band, you can come on up. 2,000 years ago, truth stood on trial. 2,000 years ago, truth was put on trial and judged by people who were devoted to lies. 2,000 years ago, Jewish leaders brought many false witnesses forward to speak against truth. There stood truth, being judged by those whose every action was bathed in lies. Jewish leaders broke almost every Jewish law that they had for holding a court of law. They broke almost every one of their Jewish laws that would protect a defendant from wrongful conviction. They fervently worked to find any testimony that would incriminate Jesus, and in their frustration, they turned to lies. And truth himself was condemned by those living lies, so that those living lies could be forgiven and made new. The truth that stood before Pilate would soon hang on a cross. Truth would be slapped, would be beaten and flogged. Truth would be mocked. Truth would be crowned with thorns. Truth would be nailed to wood. Truth would bleed. Truth would be put to death and killed by every single one of us who persist in living in lies. But this truth of Jesus absorbed the penalty for those lies. And 3 days later, the truth would rise again, violating every claim, validating every claim that he ever made. So, City Life, the question facing you today is not so much what is truth, but what will you do with Jesus?